Hello everyone, welcome back to this stage. I hope you enjoy the crash course and the workshops, because our next speaker is an extremely great one that we have been waiting for a lot. Because he has graduated from Rhode Island School of Design and from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, in later of which he stayed as a professor for over 10 years.
This creative soul has worked as a director of strategic design in a Finnish innovation fund, Sitra. And he also is a founder of Snowcone Haystack, a strategic design practice focused on helping governments and leaders to innovate. He will give us a speech on a topic of in praise of impossible challenges. So please welcome Marko Steinberg.
Kiitos. Great. Thank you very much. Sorry. You may be wondering what happened to my foot. That was another impossible challenge. So I don't recommend playing ice hockey outdoors when it's plus degrees. All right. I'm going to talk, as was mentioned, in praise of impossible projects or challenges. And this will be very much a government meets design perspective. For me, simply put, design is a process of bringing meaningful coherence to things. It's the process of conceiving and delivering that coherence. And I want to underscore that. So there is a thinking component to this, but there's also a very strong and necessary doing component to this. And for this reason, I won't be advocating or using the term design thinking, which has become very popular. Rather, I will just be speaking about design. I think those two things are inextricably bound to each other, the thinking and the doing. My position is that today's impossible challenges, and if you put it in the context of what's in the news, we're talking about healthcare reform, seems impossible in Finland, right? Education reform, the same, are actually great opportunities, not burdens. I think if you look at the way they're being talked about great burdens, that they're going to be great loss. In fact, the president advocated for cuts as a first step towards reform. I think that's actually the wrong message. You don't start by cutting things. You start actually by creating new things. And that also helps inform what you need to cut and what you don't need to cut. So anyhow, as you know, I will speak in praise of impossible challenges. I want to start with a fantastic Italian book called Il Gatto Pardo. It tells the story of the birth of Italy. Italy is a very new nation, like Finland is. And to oversimplify this story, the North decided that Italy should be unified and should be set around a parliamentary system. What Italy was up until then was basically a feudal system. Lots of different nations, all fundamentally feudal in nature, right? Princes and slaves and land, that kind of stuff. So a small group led by Garibaldi decided they would leave Turin and go down to Sicily. And it was really thought more than a military campaign as a political campaign, in that they would gain support. And as they gained support, the 1,000 would become 10,000, the 10,000 become 100,000, and they would move up the boot of Italy and unify Italy. Right? This was the sort of story. So here we have a moment in the movie. This is for those of you who may recall an actor called Burt Lancaster. He's a very American actor, pretending to be a very Sicilian prince. So one of these parliamentarians from the North, from this new model about Italy, is speaking to the prince who represents this old way of doing, and is trying to convince him to leave behind his way of doing and join this new unified parliamentary system that he's advocating for. And I think he says it very beautifully. And I think this statement applies as much to his time as it does to our time. And this is what he says: "Mine is an unhappy generation, straddling two worlds and uneasy in both." I think this is our problem today. Is we're products of a past generation with past logics and past solutions. We know that very well. We speak that language. We were educated in that world. Yet we recognize that that's not going to serve us anymore. On the other hand, there is this new world that we should be going into that we don't know the language, we're unfamiliar with, and we don't quite know how it works. So if you look at politicians, decision makers, and I think society as a whole, there is a recognition that what we've done in the past at a kind of government level is not working anymore. And yet there's a reluctance to step into this new world because it's so unfamiliar. So we're caught in between. I think that's going to be my message about how you transition being caught in between. And in that, of course, we need to think about risk and what risk means when you change worlds. I will start with how reform is generally done. Reform starts by taking the world as given, and that the new will emerge by picking and choosing the given. Right? It's a little bit like this new Italy would emerge by looking at what the feudal system is and then picking and choosing. Okay, we're not going to have slaves, but we'll still have princes, we'll have half the castles, and we'll have some land. Right? It's a diminished version. Right? And this is what happened. So this date, maybe many haven't followed this so closely, but is the date that this happened on Greek state-run TV, the equivalent of Yle in Greece. So let's take a quick look. And by the way, there's a radio going over here, which I don't know if it could be turned off, but it would be great.
Λοιπόν, έχουμε αποφασίσει ότι εμείς συνεχίζουμε.
Λοιπόν, είναι ο Πάνος Καμένος στον αύριο χώρο. Ναι, είναι ο... Ναι, έρχονται από παντού.
So if you happen to watch the news that day, this is what happened. Suddenly, it was cut off. So what the Greek state decided to do is, oh my God, we got an impossible challenge. We got this kind of fiscal pressure to reform. We have other pressures to reform. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at the boxes we have, and we're going to choose which boxes we're going to eliminate. What things are we going to cut? And they quite literally cut state TV off the air. And this is how reforms happen. This is the logic of reforms, is as if the world was a series of boxes, and what we need to do is to figure out which boxes become smaller. Does the whole thing become smaller? Do we just reorganize it in a certain way? I think that's a really limiting way of thinking of what could be. So what I'm advocating is let's not create a more efficient future, but let's redesign but let's redesign the future, right? So we don't want to be bound by what we've inherited. So I want to just highlight two challenges, I think. Why is this transition from one world to the other so difficult? The first is that you have to understand that the institutions that govern us really come from an 18th century world. They were created in a world when things were very different. And those ministries, the way of thinking about municipalities, the role of the state made sense back then, when we didn't have internet, when we didn't have airplanes, when we didn't have much mobility, when we didn't have industrialization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The world, guess what? Changed. But these institutions did not change along. So we have 18th century institutions trying to solve 21st century world. Okay? So that's one. And I won't get into any more detail to that. But the other one I want to highlight is this. This is this incredible story of Finland, right? This is GDP per capita indexed at 1900. Right? So you can see the growth, right? You can see the growth of how each Finn, how their income was growing fundamentally. And pick a date. I'm just going to make up a date right now. It's more of a placeholder. But let's say the 50s. So what happened in the 50s in Finland? Well, we all lived in the woods. That's basically what happened in the 50s. And then 2 minutes later, we had schools, hospitals, urbanization, all these things. The transformation from an agriculture, pretty much rural society to an urban industrialized society with a welfare state was incredible. It happened fundamentally overnight. And this idea of central planning, that a small elite would make clear, strong decisions on behalf of others, this was a model that was fantastic. Because as I said, one day we didn't have water, the next day we have water, right? So the benefits were clear to everybody. And then you have to understand that a whole generation of people lived in this era seeing the benefits of centrally top-down planning, right? They were believers. And even when we had the dip in the 90s, the curve just keeps going, right? It's as if what worked so well in the past will work in the future. And in fact, I think there is a kind of inbuilt deep down in the psyche of all of us Finns, this idea that what worked so well in the past will invariably work well in the future. We talk about the economic recession right now. Luckily, the language is changing a little bit. But a year ago, people were still talking, well, this is a little blip in this fantastic curve, just like the 90s was. I mean, the reality actually is it's more like this. And what I would say is the other challenge we have is a cultural delta. The gap between the memory of what works so well, the culture that produced us, the ideology we were born and shaped with, and the reality of how things are going. How do we bridge this gap really quickly? We can't afford to wait for the next generation of people to come along. We need to do these things now. So there is the institutional challenge of 18th century institutions, and there's the cultural aspect, which I think combined make it very difficult for us to believe there's a different way of doing. I want to give you 3 basic design principles to take us along in this conversation. The first one relates to something that I find very bothersome in our discourse today, in our public discourse. We talk about smaller government. Oh, fiscal austerity. We saw the Greek example, right? Okay, things aren't going well. What are we going to do? We're going to make that bad thing that we have, we'll just make it smaller, right? As if that's going to help, right? So somehow the idea is that we're going to improve things by making smaller government. I don't think that's the question. I think it's actually about smarter government. We need to make government smarter, right? And this question about money is secondary, really. States have tons of money. The question is, how are they put to use? And I think as taxpayers, at least in this part of the world, in this ideology, we may be willing to pay more taxes if it actually benefits us more in our total income sort of economy, so to speak, right? Yes, we can make smaller government, and we have to purchase all the services privately. Does that help us economically necessarily? I'm not sure. So I think we need to very quickly shift this conversation. It's not about smaller government, but it needs to be about smarter government and figuring out what that means. The second one, as I've alluded to, we need to stop trying to improve the past, and we need to start designing the future. Everything we're doing is about improving the past. How do we take the given model we have for education and make it more efficient? So what are we doing? We're consolidating schools. We're making these giant schools because it'll make less back office. But we're not fundamentally changing how we think about learning or education. What are we doing in healthcare? We're doing the exact same thing. 12 boxes is too expensive, so let's just make 4 boxes. That'll be cheaper. But we're not fundamentally thinking, what are the new processes, the new things that need to emerge? And the third thing I think we need to do very quickly is actually resourcing this innovation, this transformation, as opposed to the rhetoric. I think politically there's been a lot of rhetoric. Yes, we need to change. Yes, we need reforms. Yes, we need transformation. And then when you go and ask around, well, how are you resourcing this change? Well, it's not being resourced. It's people who have to run the day-to-day job. They're being asked to do this on the side, as if there's a hobby, right? Because we can't shut hospitals down. People need to run hospitals. And then they're asked, oh, by the way, while you're running the hospital, which I know is a full-time job, could you please also imagine what the hospital of the future could be? When you ask them, well, how many euros are you putting towards this endeavor? Actually, there is no money, right? I can tell you one big public sector organization that runs a multi-billion euro yearly budget. When pressed, at the end of the day, we figured out they had 50,000 euros to use on basically R&Ding how they think about what they do. 50,000 euros. We're going to assume that 50,000 can change how you think about using this multi-billion euro asset? No. You're going to do an event. You're going to have a cocktail party. You might have fun for an afternoon, but that's about it. All right, so let's get to the topic at hand. So what about this impossible challenge? I think rather than thinking impossible as, oh, this can't be solved, oh, healthcare reform can't be solved in Finland, or education reform can't be solved in Finland, it is actually, a recognition that they're impossible because they don't fit the current logic, the dominant view, and the models. So they're not impossible in sort of absolute terms. They're just impossible because we can't fit this peg into the shape of how we think the world right now. So why don't we change how we think about the world? Why don't we bring new tools to that? So I want to start with a small clip. It's 1962, and John F. Kennedy is talking about going to the moon. Now, many of you have heard this speech. I think it's a very eloquent speech. It's a very concise and clear speech. And you have to imagine that 7 years later, man landed on the moon. 7 years before, no one had a clue how to do it. There was no proven technology for it. There was no proven model. There were no institutions. There was actually none of the science, or a lot of the science was missing. So actually what happened is a concerted effort to build new knowledge, new institutions, and to resource this effort. And in 7 years, the impossible happened.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So I think that's a fairly remarkable speech. First of all, for kind of the clarity of the political vision, right? I always say you need to realize this is the 60s. And I think being a politician back then, it was very different from being a politician today. I would say it's much more challenging in this day and age. I think the fact that it was impossible, the message is basically, it's impossible. It forces you to rethink all the principles that are given. So you're not going to assume that tomorrow is going to be born out of the same principles by which yesterday was born, but it actually forces you to rethink. We didn't go by the moon by studying what we had already done, how horses move or how cars move. We actually developed new science, new knowledge, new principles, right? It also means the way we manage the risk of doing something new is different. It was budgeted for $7 billion. It ended up costing $25 billion, right? That could be a scandal, right? Oh my God, you guys overspent. Well, but how do you budget something that you've never done before? So I think the way in which we manage risk for something that is known versus something that's unknown needs to be very different. And this is part of the problem of why it's difficult to move from the medieval, the model of princes to the modern model of parliament, is that we're trying to use medieval laws to govern how we're going to create that transition, right? So when I used to work at the fund, a lot of people would say in meetings, oh yes, we want to take on big problems, we want to take on risk, but by the way, could you tell us exactly how you're going to do it, how much it's going to cost, and give me an exact schedule for it? So we need to think about the culture and the processes differently that then can create tomorrow. A fantastic story, I speak frequently of this. In Chile, Constitución, a town probably about the size of Vasa, a little smaller than Lahti, in 2010 was completely obliterated by a tsunami. And so city planning and the leaders had a very difficult and important question to answer. How are we going to rebuild? Now, if we rebuild or build in Europe, take Finland, take Helsinki, the average time to make a master plan for a new area is about 10 to 15 years. Okay? Let's stop for a moment. Think about what that actually is. It takes 10 to 15 years for a bunch of people to agree on where their lines are going to be on a piece of paper. That's how long it takes. Okay? So they said, look, we can't do this. We can't have people waiting that long without homes. So we're going to do what usually takes 15 years, and we're going to do it in 90 days. Okay? So it was impossible. If you did that in Finland, everybody would be like, oh, that's impossible. Yeah, well, that's what the Chileans did. And it forced them to rethink the principles, to say, look, and it's very healthy, actually. It was a self-imposed timeline, because everybody recognized that what they knew was not going to be the solution. So they rethought the political process, the planning process, the engagement process, the legal process, you name it. And they cleared the main square. They put a tent up, which was their design headquarters. They put a list of priorities outside. Anybody could come and see what they're talking about, and they could come in and participate in that conversation. I would say that's passive participation. You're asking people to come on your terms, but they were very active also. They sent people into everybody's homes to have conversation on our terms, on the terms of the citizens. Right? Not city hall terms, we'll come to your neighborhood, to your home, and talk about what's important. What are your priorities? What's your vision for the future? Deep engagement process that happened with the political process that happened with the planning process. Usually what you do is you make a plan, and then you see if people like it. Well, they did that at the same time, constantly. And at the end of 90 days, they had a master plan, and the city voted. And 97% of the citizens voted for the master plan. Now, I ask you to find me any other corner of democracy in the world that can give you those kinds of figures. So they didn't start by saying, well, we'll take the 15-year process, we'll do half the public hearings, we usually do, and we'll accelerate some of the approval processes, so we'll get to 5 years. No, they said, we're going to rethink this. And by rethinking it, they came up with a better, faster, and cheaper model, right? But you don't start by thinking about what's cheaper and what's faster. You think about actually what are the new processes, the new modes of engagement. Now, planning in Finland is a big challenge. Not just Finland, Europe-wide. This is usually what happens. The top-down view tells you that we're going to do this, and the bottom-up citizen perspective says, no, you're not. So you get a house in the middle of a highway, right? In Finland, we have 1,200 master plans for approval every year. 9% of these go to court. Of these cases, 75% are brought up by citizens. So the majority of cases that go to court are citizen-driven. For a master plan to be in court, it's a minimum 2-year stop on the project. This means any private money that was going to come in as investments into the project is going to run away. There's nothing that money hates more than uncertainty. Okay? And if the courts then give a green light to the project, say, okay, you can continue anyhow. You've lost that money. You probably built even more public resentment. So your next effort to do some reform, whether it be healthcare, education, or another master planning, will probably have even more objection towards it. You spend the few euros of tax money that we have on very expensive court cases. This is all a horrible picture for how you build a good society. So can we actually use some of the Constitution approaches to do this? We've done this, and I guarantee that the engagement process, rethinking how we plan, can help us save money, can make the investment environment more stable, can manage a lot of the risks short and long term. But it's not about making the current process more efficient. It's about coming up with new ways. I think one way to think about impossible projects are the given ones, or help break out of the dominant way of thinking about it by just thinking counterintuitively. It's, I think, a way of forcing you to break out of one's logic. So I think this can be one tool to think about it. So let me give you a few very quick examples. Dropouts as lead users would be a counterintuitive way to think about this, right? So in Finland, like everywhere else, 16-year-old boys are at the highest risk of dropping out of high school. No one quite knows how to figure it out, how to solve this problem. It's always seen as a burden. These are a burden to the system. They don't fit into the system. Well, what if we thought about it the other way around? What if these were actually very advanced learners? They have a new way learning needs. And actually, it's the system that hasn't adapted to them. And I will tell you that if we can solve their problem, we'll help solve everybody else's problem. So take this group not as a burden on the system, but actually as a group that will challenge you to rethink how you want to deliver education. The second one, which seems also counterintuitive, is free housing. Okay? So less here, but in the US, very common problem is homelessness. And in 2005, the state of Utah figured out that it was costing them actually more to keep people on the street because of emergency care costs, because of prison costs, because of all kinds of costs, than to actually give them a free apartment, right? This is a very difficult pitch to do in an increasingly conservative American context, to say we're going to give free housing, and this actually makes economic sense, right? But it does. It makes financial sense, and actually when you give free housing, not only is it cheaper, but you also get these people off the street for the long term, right? Very counterintuitive. The third thing is best healthcare is actually no healthcare, right? Think about it. The objective of healthcare is to keep you healthy. If you're healthy, you need no healthcare, right? And there's a vicious circle, a misalignment of sort of interest between the provision and the sale of healthcare and actually the objective of healthcare, which is to keep you healthy, right? So actually the perfect system would be that we have such an incredible healthcare system that you never get sick, and hence you never need healthcare. I know this sounds a bit circular, but that's probably it. Same thing in energy, for example. Energy companies are incentivized to sell you energy. On the other hand, policy is trying to help you to reduce it. So in California, what they decided is, because they had public energy companies, was rather than make profit by selling more, they were going to change the incentives and have companies make profit by selling less. So they put a budget cap on energy companies, and they said, your profit will be actually what you can keep between this budget cut and what you actually sell. Suddenly the incentive is completely different, and things are aligned, right? But it feels counterintuitive. But sometimes that is the path to actually breaking the system. And I think where I want to focus on for just a few more minutes is citizens first. Now, this seems kind of ridiculous, right? Of course, government, citizens. I don't think citizens come first in government. We've been through a whole period of nation building where I think the focus has been, for many good reasons, on institution building, not on citizenry building necessarily. And I think now is the moment where we have the tools, but also the citizenry to change this equation. Let me give you a very simple example. Many of you are familiar with this. This is in Kamppi, near Lassi Palazzi. Camionette a few years ago wanted to sell crepes. Completely illegal, broke all the rules, right? Well, one of the rules was it's not a car and it's not a restaurant, right? This was terrible. City Hall couldn't figure out what category to put this thing in, right? And this was the problem, is we're organized this way in government, and yet the problem is a different shape. And we assume that we're going to force people or the problem to fit our definition of the world. And no, it has to happen the other way around now. We need to actually fit the shape of government to meet the shape of the world we live in, right? Also because there are new forms that actually make the old rules and the old divisions completely obsolete. Now everybody knows ravintolapäivä, right? What do you do with ravintolapäivä? It's completely illegal. You can't open a restaurant without a license, right? But what do you do when 600 people open up 600 restaurants for one day? You go around with a mega truck and arrest everybody? Or even better plan, arrest Facebook, which is the platform that everyone is using. Actually, these new forms of production defy the laws, regulations, and institutions because they came from an 18th century. They don't understand the 21st century, right? These are the great new forms. I'm not going to say they're going to solve everything, but they're beginning to really bring citizenry first. So here's a project I want to just talk very briefly about. This was Jana. When I was at Sitra, we hired as part of a program which was to embed designers, this capability to create the future into public services. She worked for social services, and the problem they had there where she worked on was families with children. It turns out that families at greatest crisis, greatest risk of crisis, are the ones that have the hardest time finding the public services they need. Right? And if I have a kid and I'm having a crisis at 2 in the morning, what's one of the channels that I'm most likely to use in the middle of the night? I probably will use my computer and go online and see how do I get help. And if I put Helsinki Social Services, I will get a website that tells me how they're organized, what departments they have, and so on. And do you think I really care? I don't care. That's their problem, how they want to organize themselves. I want to know what the service is. How do I get it? It needs to be much more like Google. Right? All you have to do is say what you want, and it will find a path for you. It's not trying to explain what's the logic that you need to now adopt to even find what you need. So that's what we did. And we made a website. It's not beautiful. It's not perfect. But it has the basic information you need. It doesn't talk about how it's organized. It has a phone number that you can use. There's a drop-down menu. The part of town that you live in tells you who's available right now, what is their personal phone number. And further down, there's another sort of half screen where you could give some feedback. So the idea is let's put something very quick out there, see how people react to it, get feedback, and start polishing and improving that service. Now, a public procurement decision was made in 4 days for this, meaning the government, the state, decided we're going to do this and put money towards it. In 2 weeks, we had the service live. So for me, this is smarter government. I challenge any business to make a new business decision about a product or service in 4 days and have it on the market in 2 weeks. Right? That's quite challenging. So I think government, when it's smart, it can use its huge muscle to flex very quickly. All I've talked about is really a very different way of doing, which I would call is proposition-based approach. It's not an analysis-based approach. Right? When we do healthcare reform, we like to go to Sweden, Denmark, and Norway and see what models they have, study it till we know every detail, and we have certainty of how they work, and then optimize it for our context. Well, guess what? Many of the things we're working on, no one else has figured out, and there is no model to copy. So the way to do it is actually to come up with what if, And by iterating, you begin to garner the intelligence you need to refine that. This defies the political system we have, the role of politicians versus civil servants. It defies the whole system. And ultimately, I'm not talking about just services. I'm talking about how do we redesign this whole system to deliver and behave in a fundamentally different way. Yes, we need new solutions, but we also need to rethink how we frame problems. How do we rethink health or learning? And by doing that, we can actually shape the architecture of our solution towards very different kinds of solutions. So I'm almost done. I have a list for those, I assume there aren't many in the audience, that represent government. But if you know people, you can send my message to them. I have 5 priorities for government, okay? How do we get government, not to make the transformation quite yet, but to create the preconditions to make a successful transformation? So I'm not saying, government, this is how you're going to build a bridge. But how do you prepare yourself mentally so that you know how to build a bridge? The first is there needs to be a very clear public sector mandate, not just to administer, but to innovate. The role of government right now is just to administer. Make sure that everybody's obeying the laws, the rules, and so on and so on. There is no resourcing, as I said, to actually create that which does not exist. There has to be a mandate for this. It's your obligation to innovate yourself. The second, which goes to my rhetoric point, is that there has to be actual money that's dedicated to this. Not a little bit of extra money to help things that are already happening happen quicker. Actually dedicated money to create new stuff. If I was a company, probably of my yearly budget, 2 to 6% of that would be dedicated to R&Ding how I do things, potentially new services and products. This is compared to probably 0.001%, is an optimistic number, that government uses. The third thing is, why don't we talk about M&As, mergers and acquisitions? Right? What do big and slow and somewhat dumb companies do? I don't mean dumb in a bad way, I mean in a positive way. They have inertia, okay? They recognize that the new ideas, the new visions of the world, the new experimentation happens in small companies that aren't bound by legacy or anything like that. And so what do they do to maintain their smartness? Is they buy it in. What's our conversation in the public sector? Is shed. Is the opposite. Makes no sense. So why couldn't government merge and acquire those pockets of innovation in the public sector that are happening? Buy a small team, bring in a little nonprofit organization, and help transform themselves. The fourth one of my 5 is create career paths. In Finland especially, there's very little mobility between different sectors. There are people in public sector who have no experience about business. There are people in design with no clue about public sector, et cetera, et cetera. We need to create mobility so people can begin to connect different kinds of experiences, people, and knowledge in new ways. And the last one I have here, before coming to my 2 concluding thoughts, is you need to build this, I'm calling it design capability. And the question is, do you put it in the heart of the beast, like in the Prime Minister's office, in the middle of where stuff happens? The challenge is that it will probably get eaten by the beast, meaning that it will be put so many rules and regulations of how to behave and dress and so on, that it will start behaving like the rest of the organization. Now, you could put it completely outside. It's a small resource, and it has all the freedom to do everything differently. But the mothership will look at it and say, oh, you're irrelevant, you're not us. You're this freak that does stuff on its own. So my model has been, I think we need to come up with an inside-outside. We need a dedicated resource, has new knowledge, new modes of working, new money, that is dedicated to creating tomorrow, that has the freedom to behave differently, but is an integral part of the beast, so to speak. In Finland, I think that's difficult. We have a very egalitarian society. Are we culturally willing to give a group of people the freedom to behave differently from the rest? And I think in Finland, we find that a very difficult tension. We all have the same rules, or everybody has no rules. But that people would have different rules, I think is very difficult for us. All right, so the challenge, 2 very simple. 1, I don't buy this idea. The crisis is the mother of invention. So we're getting in Europe into this moment where we're in crisis, and crisis is going to force us to create this great new tomorrow. So let me give you an example. I showed Greece at the beginning. I'm going to show Greece at the end. This is Parliament. Parliament is voting a series of very important laws around the legal profession to help meet the Troika's economic requirements for loans. Okay?
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, είμαστε 3 άνθρωποι στην Επιτροπή. Έτσι θα γίνει η ψηφοφορία του κώδικα περί δικηγόρων?
Αυτή τη στιγμή έχουν κατατεθεί οι απόψεις των εκπροσώπων και των εισηγητών. Λοιπόν, προχωρούμε στην ψηφοφορία.
Με τρεις βουλευτές.
So there's only 3 parliamentarians voting on this.
Για να είμαστε τυπικά εντάξει. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 1, εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 2, εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 3, εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 29, εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 30, εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 31 όπως τροποποιήθηκε από τον κύριο Υπουργό.
Όχι, ποιος λέει ναι στο 31? Ποιος λέει ναι, λέμε όχι στο 31, ποιος λέει ναι?
Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 32 όπως...
Ποιος λέει ναι, κύριε Πρόεδρε, πώς λέτε κατά πλειοψηφία?
All right, you get the picture, okay? So he's just going through and saying the majority, majority, majority. No one is actually voting, right? This is the heart of democracy. So what I'm actually arguing is when crisis hits, the question is, do we really think people will be more strategic in their ability to make decisions or less strategic? And my fear is we become less strategic when crisis hits. And in fact, we're ready to jettison basic values that we hold dear and close to us. The other question is, you'll hear a lot, well, we're already innovating. We're doing a lot of innovative stuff. I find this at times quite dangerous because it doesn't meet the reality. It's an easy way for people to say, oh, we're doing lots of interesting projects, lots of hankkees in Finland, right? And so now we've checked the box and we can keep driving like we used to drive, right? This is also in the design community, in the nonprofit community. We're doing exciting things. Well, this is the problem, right? So think of the mainstream as kind of a solar system with tons of pull. So what this we're already innovating does really, it's really space dust, right? Nonprofits do great projects, don't get me wrong, on 5,000 euro budgets, fantastic. And yet we're passing laws and we're talking about hundreds and billions of euros investments and making new power plants and energy. I mean, we're not changing that beast. So to end on this, I would say, this is the nice end of the Gattopardo. He says, everything has to change to remain the same. And so for me, if this argument about design, about how we transition and resourcing that transition to the new world is at the margins, the mainstream will just keep running. And so I think part of this is to think of these impossible challenges, healthcare, education, the social welfare promise, not as burdens, but as actually great opportunities to invite. I think these, as I've hopefully shown, redefine the principles that govern better outcomes at lower costs, which at the end of the day is the objective of government. How do we do better health with less resources? And given all that we know now about how things work, about science, would we really build, for example, the education systems we have and the healthcare systems we have? I don't think so. It makes little sense to divide people by age into little groups and move them from class to class based on an idea of knowledge that's based into little boxes. I don't think so. So I think this question of impossible is in the eye of the beholder. Thanks. I should run off. Sorry? I should run off.
If you wish, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thanks
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you very much.
So much. This was great.
Yeah. So. All right. Okay. Yeah. So next we're gonna have a short break. We're gonna set up our talk show studio, and in 5 minutes we're going to have an interesting discussion about the future of our beloved university.
So stay put and feel free to share your thoughts about the previous talk in Twitter.
Yeah.
Remember the hashtag.
HBS Symposium. All right.
HBS
So see you in
Symposium.
5 minutes. Don't move. Don't move.